Some people go missing because something terrible happens to them, but others disappear because they want to. They leave their families, they abandon their names, they erase themselves, and never look back. Before we begin, consider subscribing. These are true cases of people who vanished on purpose and didn't want to be found. In 1974, in Indiana, Lula gave birth to her third child, a moment that should have marked the beginning of a new chapter. Instead, it marked the last time she was seen in her old life. There wasn't chaos, there wasn't panic. Her disappearance began quietly, a woman stepping away without leaving a trace. Her home remained intact, her car stayed parked, her phone and belongings showed no struggle. For authorities, that presented a unique challenge. When physical evidence is absent, every theory becomes speculation. But investigators tried anyway. Officials interviewed family and friends. They checked phone records. They searched hospitals and morgues. They looked for fingerprints, footprints, witnesses, anything that could explain where Lula had gone. But nothing. No one saw her leave. No one heard her speak of plans. No conflicts were documented. No threats were reported. It was as if she simply chose not to be found. And that possibility both frustrated and baffled investigators, because it contradicted the most common assumptions about missing women. Women, especially mothers, don't usually vanish without warning. That's why for years authorities continued to suspect foul play, even without evidence. Months became years. Telephone tips dried up. New leads fizzled out. Lula's children grew older, not knowing where she was or what happened to her. Her file gathered dust in a cabinet somewhere. But that quiet end wasn't the final chapter. Decades later, police departments started using new resources for cold cases: digital record matching, biometric data comparisons, and cross-state identity tracking. These tools were designed to link old reports with current records. And when detectives plugged Lula's information into these newer systems, something unexpected turned up. There was a match. In Texas, someone living under another name had a record that partially overlapped with Lula's. Same birth date, same physical characteristics, just not the same identity. That triggered a deeper look. Investigators traveled to Texas. They confirmed the woman's identity using official methods: fingerprints, records, and identity verification processes. It was Lula Gillespie-Miller, alive, living quietly under a different name, not hidden in fear, not in danger, just living. And that's when something extraordinary happened. Instead of seeking reconnection, Lula declined contact. She chose to remain private. She acknowledged her identity but refused interviews, reunions, or public explanation. That choice, made after decades, revealed something unsettling about her disappearance. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't forced. It was intentional. Most missing persons cases are tragic because the person never returns. But Lula's case challenges that assumption. A mother left without evidence of foul play. And the most crucial point investigators had to accept: Lula had the legal right to leave. In the eyes of the law, as an adult with capacity, she was allowed to start over, even if it meant never contacting her family again. Her disappearance was not a mystery of violence. It was a personal decision. Imagine being her children, growing up with unanswered questions, trying to understand why she walked away. That emotional void is still present in cases like this. There isn't closure. There isn't a found at last reunion. There is only a discovery and then silence. Lula's disappearance took decades to uncover, but the next case vanished in a matter of hours, with only one confirmed action: a single ATM withdrawal and a life that would never return. On a quiet September morning in 2004, a young man stepped out of his apartment and vanished without a trace. No struggle, no evidence, no body, just a car, abandoned, and a mystery that would last 7 years. When he was eventually found alive, he didn't want to go home. and he wouldn't say why. This is the story of Timothy Edward Carney, the missing man who showed up years later, but left everyone wondering, why? On September 28, 2004, 25-year-old Timothy Carney left his apartment in Butler, New Jersey, just before dawn. His roommate saw him head out, walking into another ordinary day. Tim was due at a 7 a.m. church prayer meeting that morning, something he did regularly. But he never made it. By mid-morning, when he didn't show up for work and there was no contact, alarm bells went off. He had called his supervisor earlier, telling them he'd be late due to the rain, and that would be the last known interaction anyone had with him for years. Initially, police treated Tim's disappearance like any other, a missing adult. Investigators checked his apartment for anything out of place. They looked for signs of foul play. They interviewed friends and coworkers. But everything looked normal, except that he wasn't there. His personal items were still in the home. His belongings weren't scattered. His life didn't seem in ruins. Nothing suggested he was forced away. Then investigators discovered something that changed how the case was seen. About a week after Tim vanished, his 2000 green Chrysler Concorde LXI was found parked on the side of the road, just outside Newark. It stood unattended near a construction site with no signs of a struggle. No blood, no broken glass, no clues. For detectives, this was perplexing. Usually when a car is left behind like that, it's a clue, sometimes a sign of foul play. But here, it didn't explain why Tim had left it there, or where he went. Even more puzzling was what came next. 4 days after he disappeared, on October 2, 2004, surveillance video from an ATM showed a man resembling Tim withdrawing $1,000 in cash from his bank account. The footage showed someone with a baseball cap pulled low, obscuring his face. Investigators couldn't confirm the person's identity beyond a reasonable doubt, but the timing was undeniable. No credit cards were used. No phone calls were made from his phone. Just that single, large withdrawal. It was the only solid lead in the case, and it hinted at something unsettling. This wasn't the disappearance of someone taken by force. This looked like a choice. Tim's parents, Ed and Phyllis Carney, didn't give up. They placed billboards along New Jersey highways, hoping someone would recognize their son. "If you can hear me, come home. We love you," Phyllis said in a news interview years later, emotions raw and unresolved. Family members believed that something deeper was happening, not a random disappearance, but something connected to Tim's personal life. Tim was a member of a Christian group called Gospel Outreach, a small evangelical organization. According to family accounts, his involvement with the group had grown over time, and so had the concern about how it influenced him. Some relatives described the group as intense or cult-like, saying leaders became increasingly controlling. One family member told police that at one point, church members insisted on accompanying Tim to visit a sick aunt in the hospital. Not because they were caring, but because they wanted to make sure there really was an aunt. That level of influence raised questions. Was Tim under pressure? Was he led to cut ties with his family? Or had he simply walked away on his own? Police never confirmed that the church was responsible, but it became a central point of speculation. Without solid evidence, the case became a topic for discussion among true crime viewers and missing person communities. Some theorized that Tim felt overwhelmed by expectations, financial, social, or spiritual, and chose to start a new life. Others thought external influence, whether emotional or organizational, pushed him to sever old connections. There was even debate about identity change, since he withdrew a large sum of money and never accessed his bank cards again. But without confirmation, each theory remained just that, theory. Then almost exactly 7 years later, a breakthrough arrived. In September 2011, authorities located Timothy Carney alive and well. But the discovery was anything but a happy ending. Police confirmed his identity and notified his family. His missing persons case was officially closed because he was safe. Yet despite being found, Tim did not want contact with his family. He chose not to disclose his whereabouts. He refused details about where he had been. He did not want it publicly shared. That silence revealed something striking. He was no longer the same person who left his apartment in 2004, and he didn't want to return to that life. Tim's family told the press they were relieved he was safe, but also perplexed about why he stayed away so long. One spokesperson for a missing persons advocacy group said, "We know where he is, and his family knows where he is, but we don't really know what's in his mind right now." What actually happened to Tim during those 7 years remains unknown. Did he want a fresh start? Did he dislike his old life? Was something else influencing him? No official statement was ever released. Tim never spoke publicly about his disappearance, and he never made contact with those who searched for him. So if no foul play was proven, if he was alive and unharmed, then what could make a man walk away completely and never come back? In the next case, someone didn't just walk away. She erased her identity entirely, and no one knew who she truly was until long after she was gone. In the early 1960s, Anita Drake was living a life that looked ordinary from the outside. Details about her early life are limited, not because they were unimportant, but because she left very few clues behind. According to public missing person discussions and historical observations among cold case researchers, Anita left her known life quietly, with no reported struggle and no firm explanation. Sources note that she vanished from contact with her family and circle without a clear trace, and not in circumstances that suggested foul play. Her case faded into the background of long-term missing person files, another unsolved disappearance from decades past. But years later, her story took an unexpected turn. Long after Anita was listed as missing from her family's life, new investigative tools and DNA technology began reshaping how cold cases were approached. Researchers and genealogists started using family tree databases, cross-referencing old missing persons records with modern identity data, a process that had never been possible before the digital era. In 2017, investigators revisiting Anita's case noticed what looked like a possible identity match to someone living under a different name, a person who had been known socially and culturally in her community, but whose origin couldn't be traced back to any official early life records. That discovery prompted a deeper investigation. Investigators worked slowly but methodically. Historical documents, birth records, and DNA evidence were traced. Every legal connection had to be verified, because linking a missing person to a living identity after decades requires certainty, not assumption. Eventually, analysts confirmed that the person living under this alternate name was the same woman who once disappeared without explanation. The timeline matched, birth data matched, genetic ties to family lines matched. It was the same person, but with a life and identity that had remained hidden for years. But the story wasn't over yet. Unlike typical missing persons cases that involve abduction or foul play, Anita Drake's disappearance didn't include any evidence of violence. There were no witnesses who reported seeing her taken, no indications of struggle, no emergency calls, no ransom demands, just silence, just absence. When the connection was finally made years later, there was still no public explanation from Anita herself. And that's because, as those investigative sources reveal, she had likely walked away on her own terms. That may be why, during her lifetime after the disappearance, she never reached out to her family, and there was no indication she ever intended to. Once Anita assumed her new identity, she lived out her life in a way that suggests stability, growth, and continuity. She wasn't hiding in fear. She wasn't in crisis. She built a life distinct from the one she left behind. And because names, paperwork, and public records in the pre-digital era weren't as interconnected as they are today, her trail remained undetected for decades. Only modern investigative technology brought the connection to light. Anita's case is not about crime or circumstance. It's about choice. It's about the fact that, before the digital age, a person could slip out of one identity and never be traced again if they didn't want to be. She didn't make headlines at the time. She didn't trigger alerts. And she didn't leave clues that pointed to an outside threat. Instead, she stepped into a different life, changed her identity, and disappeared without drama. Not tragedy, disappearance. Not lost, redirected. Think about that for a moment. No struggle, no forced separation, no forensic trace. Just a decision to walk away from everything known and to build something entirely new. In earlier decades, such transformations were rare, but they were possible. And in Anita's case, they were successful. Because she wasn't found until decades later, and only then because new forensic tools made the impossible possible. When cases like this emerge, they do more than solve a missing person file. They change how investigators view past disappearances. Instead of assuming danger, violence, or abduction in every case, they begin to consider, what if someone chose to leave? And when that becomes a possibility, the search changes. Not from finding someone who was lost, but finding someone who didn't want to be found. So if Anita's disappearance was voluntary, and she lived decades under a different identity, the question becomes clear. How far can someone go to erase their past and avoid detection? In the next story, a man went even further, not just by taking a new name, but by choosing the identity of a deceased child. And no one discovered the truth until after his death. When police found the body in his modest Ohio apartment in 2002, they thought they knew who he was: a quiet retiree, a loner, an ordinary man. But within days, that assumption fell apart. The name stamped on his death certificate, Joseph Newton Chandler III, was fake. Because the real Joseph Newton Chandler III had died as a child decades earlier. This is the story of a man who stood as someone who never existed, hid his own past, and managed to avoid detection for decades. And just when investigators finally solved the mystery, they still had no idea why he vanished from his former life. In July 2002, officers responding to a wellness check in Eastlake, Ohio, discovered a decomposed body in a small apartment, located only after neighbors noticed the mail piling up, and an unusual silence from someone known locally as Joseph Newton Chandler III. The cause of death appeared to be suicide by firearm, and the body wasn't found until nearly a week after the event because no one had reported him missing. Detectives expected a routine case, but something didn't add up. His fingerprints were unusable due to decomposition, and the few records connected to his name led back decades. No known relatives, no next of kin, only a trail of old work history and an apartment lease. They began digging. Detectives found bank records showing the man, who called himself Joseph Chandler, had about $82,000 in his savings account, but no one came forward to claim it. That's when the first big question hit. If he really was Joseph Newton Chandler III, where were his relatives? Because the real Joseph Chandler had died in 1945 at the age of 8, along with both parents in a car accident in Texas. It was an astonishing discovery. The name on the suicide certificate didn't belong to him. He had stolen it, and he had lived under that name for more than 2 decades. How did he manage it? Records show that in 1978, the man applied for a Social Security card using a copy of the birth certificate of the real Joseph Newton Chandler III, the boy who died in 1945. He did this in Rapid City, South Dakota, a place no one in his old life was tracking. Once he had a Social Security number under that name, he moved to Cleveland and the surrounding Ohio area, where he began a new life. Under his assumed identity, he worked as an electrical designer and draftsman, held a job at a chemical company, and lived alone in the Eastlake area for about 24 years. To neighbors and coworkers, he was smart, quiet, and deeply private, but no one suspected he was living a completely fabricated life. From the outside, Chandler was a loner, but not necessarily a suspect in any crime. He worked hard, paid his bills, kept to himself. Some co-workers described him as eccentric and strange, but he wasn't aggressive. He wasn't violent. He wasn't on any public law enforcement radar. And yet, everything about his life before 1978 was untraceable, because he never used his birth name again. Once investigators realized his Chandler identity couldn't be real, they began digging deeper. They tested DNA from a tissue sample taken from the man during a 2000 hospital visit, 2 years before his death. That DNA, when compared to modern genealogical databases, eventually pointed to a likely surname, Nichols. That lead brought in forensic genealogists who mapped family trees. And finally, in 2018, law enforcement made a breakthrough. The man known as Joseph Newton Chandler III was actually Robert Ivan Nichols, born in New Albany, Indiana, in 1926. The identification was confirmed when investigators located his son, Philip Nichols, and matched his DNA to the mysterious Eastlake man. Robert Ivan Nichols wasn't some unknown drifter before he became Chandler. He was a World War II Navy veteran who served aboard the USS Aaron Ward and received a Purple Heart after being wounded in combat. After the war, he married and had 3 children. But sometime in the mid-1960s, everything changed. In 1964, he filed for divorce. In a letter to his son, postmarked 1965 from Napa, California, he sent only a penny and vanished. His family reported him missing that same year, and nothing was heard from him again under his real name. From that moment on, his trail went cold, until it resurfaced under an assumed identity more than a decade later. Here's where the case becomes truly baffling. Authorities confirmed who he was, but they still have no definitive reason for why he assumed a stolen identity in his early 50s. He wasn't fleeing a crime that anyone has been able to prove. There were no known warrants out for his arrest. His co-workers didn't describe him as dangerous or criminal. In fact, the only crimes associated with him were committed by someone else in his name, because the real Joseph Chandler died as a child. U.S. Marshals themselves have said they don't know what he was running from. Was it guilt? Fear? Shame? A desire to disappear from his former life completely? There's no verified record that answers that question. In July 2002, Robert, still living as Chandler, locked the doors, turned off the air conditioning, and ended his life. By the time police found his body, decomposition made fingerprints useless and identification impossible. His death looked like a lonely end, but it sparked a mystery that would endure for nearly 2 decades. When genealogical breakthroughs finally solved the identity puzzle, it answered who he was, but not why he chose to live as a phantom for 24 years. This isn't just about identity theft. It's a story about a man who walked away from one life, reinvented himself completely, and managed to exist undetected for a generation. It shows how, before the digital age, someone could craft an entirely new existence using a dead child's identity and remain unchallenged for decades. And it also reminds us that some disappearances aren't about danger, they're about escape. So if Robert Nichols disappeared to become someone else, what about the people who reappeared after decades? Case number 5 involves a woman who vanished in the early 1960s and was finally confirmed alive more than 60 years later. So far, we've explored people who walked away quietly, assumed entirely new identities, people who lived in plain sight. These are just some of the people who chose to disappear. And their stories remind us that sometimes the greatest mysteries aren't about crime or danger, they're about choice. Some will never be found because they didn't want to be. Subscribe and stay tuned for next episode.